sprouts.
Okay, well, thank you, Nick. It's good to be with everyone again. Brussels sprouts have always fascinated me. You know, most consumers say they don't like Brussels sprouts for some reason. I don't understand it. You know, my mother fed them to me when I was a child. I think some people, you know, kind of can taste some of the metallic, you know, glycosides that are in the background, and some of those are kind of sharp and bitter, and they just don't taste right. But you know, I really migrate to Brussels sprouts in the fall and winter. Those are kind of one of my go-to green vegetables. And I thought a few years ago, oh, it'd be nice to do a trial that looks a little bit at some of the sprouts that are out there, and you know, kind of get a sense as to what's available and how they produce, and you know, what kind of issues are there. And as a result of that, I also asked Dr. Nischwitz and Nick to you know, talk a little bit about some of the brassica problems. And so Claudia will come on and talk about brassica diseases a little bit here in a few minutes, and then Nick will talk about some of the insect issues that kind of deal with the brassicas. And there are some, you know, kind of problems that we have to address as we're working through these crops. So overview, we're going to just talk a little bit about some of the, you know, kind of key issues to getting brassicas. And this is general to all brassicas, but we're going to kind of focus our attention mostly on Brussels sprouts as we move forward. Some stuff about varietal selection, nutritional needs, irrigation, trying to create crop uniformity. Here we have a Brussels sprout, and if you look closely there, every sprout from the top to the bottom is about the same size, and that's really, it kind of gives us some, you know, kind of opportunities for marketing, but there may be instances where you don't want that. And so we can kind of address those as well. Some weed management considerations as well. So most of our brassica crops actually do best when we transplant them. And so from a seed production perspective, to get successes and grow a good transplant, what we really need to do is have ideal germination conditions for our transplant trays. And generally we look at temperatures that are in that 70 to 80 degree range being optimum for really rapid uniform emergence. And if we can get that rapid uniform emergence, then what we're going to do is we're going to actually get more uniform plants, and more uniform plants mean more uniform production. And there are instances in our farming systems where that becomes really important, because we maybe need to produce enough in a short period of time to, you know, market. And then there may be other instances where we're really interested only in getting a crop so much to come on at a time, and we don't want too much, but we don't want to always be planting as well. And so certainly use good, moist, sterile soil mix. I like to use the 128 cell trays. That produces a nice plant in about 6 weeks or 7 weeks. You can see that second image here. We're going to get a nice root ball that's you know, got a lot of roots growing in it. We can it holds together nicely, so it comes out of the tray really easy. The plant should have about 3 or 4 leaves. If it's bigger than that, it just transplants poorly and it doesn't establish very well. And then more importantly, by the time it's up to the 5 or 6 leaf stage, that root ball is so wound up and compacted that the plant doesn't establish itself very well. When we're seeding in those trays, ideally we would like to get those seeds pretty shallow, because the brassica seeds, whether we're talking about Brussels sprouts or cabbage, are really tiny. And so singulation becomes a bit of an issue. And certainly with some of these newer hybrids, seed costs are kind of high. So, you know, try to figure out a way to get a single seed in there if you're growing your own plants, and don't plant them too deep, because when you plant them deep, then more than a ½ inch, what happens is that really impacts how uniformly they establish and grow, and that creates non-uniform trays of plants where what we would like is each one to look exactly alike. And basically the key is this, does the root ball hold together? And if that root ball holds together, then you can transplant it, and that's when it's going to be most effective in doing that. So those are the keys if we're going to grow transplants. And then from a moisture and nutrition perspective, make sure that we're, kind of keeping our mix hydrated, let the surface dry out between irrigations. And then we need to be fertigating those seedlings about once a week with a soluble fertilizer mix. And that soluble mix can be either organic type or inorganic fertilizer. The plant, wants the nutrition. That's the important thing. And so if you're going to grow organic plants, you just have to maybe feed a little bit more. I know the guys that work for me really hate it when they have to do fish emulsion and spread that around, because it makes a terrible stink, and they kind of complain about that. But for the most part, we do grow a lot of organic plants each year, several thousand organic brassica plants, and we've had extremely good success with using fish emulsion as a weekly addition for growing those transplants. Then when we're thinking about growing those plants out in the field, really what we want to do is try to, get those crops to grow at an optimal rate. And establishment is probably the most sensitive stage to getting that plant to function for the remainder of the growing season. And at the bottom here, we have a list of the various brassica crops and how tolerant they are to minimum temperatures or lower than the minimum temperature. So planting early can be important for us. And so kale and Brussels sprouts are the most cold tolerant, and they will take the most cold and even the most frost. But at a transplant stage, interestingly enough, if it's too cold for too long, those plants get damaged. And so we need to kind of be concerned a little bit about, trying to push the envelope a little bit too closely. And so for your particular growing area, and we have people from all over Utah attending and all over the Western US attending today, you need to kind of find out kind of when those frost dates are for your location. When is the average last frost of the spring? And that then helps you kind of pick a planting date, because with these brassicas, and particularly with the ones that are more hardy, like Brussels sprouts and cabbage, we can usually plant those 2 to 3 to maybe even 4 weeks before the last frost date. And so if we have plants ready, that helps you kind of think about the timeline for getting things established. And so that always is a bit of a challenge. Ideally, these plants really like to grow at temperatures between 70 and 80. And so if our average daily temperature is up around that 80-degree mark, they do well through the whole summer. And that's pretty much what Cache Valley is like. We have that kind of cool nights, warm days. We average out about 80 degrees, and those plants just thrive under those types of conditions. The plants really don't like it when it gets really, really hot. So if we have days above 100, they suffer. And so we have to kind of take that into account, as well as we're dealing with the growth of the crop. And as I stated, this establishment period is the most critical one, and it's how those plants kind of get themselves set so that they can grow through the remainder of the season. If we're looking at varieties, there are lots of choices out there. And we went through and we kind of did a broad search of mostly hybrids. And we were looking for stuff that wanted uniform maturity. We wanted uniformity of the sprouts along the stalk. And we were looking for, nice quality sprouts as well that met, certain criteria. And so we kind of focused our attention mostly on the hybrids, the F1 hybrids that are out there. There are many open pollinated types that work very well, but they are a little bit more non-uniform, and we were kind of looking for uniformity. So here's a couple of, a bunch of the ones that we kind of looked at, and then we made some selections out of that group. So we kind of gathered names. We kind of looked at other locations and said, well, what do we want to do? And we wanted to have a very early maturing type. So Hesta is a very early maturing Brussels sprout. We looked at Marta, and Marta is kind of a mid-season. And then we looked at Dagon, and that is a late maturing type. And you can see normally that there are maturing types that are pretty quick. They tend to be shorter statured plants, and therefore they produce fewer sprouts along the stalk. And these later maturing types, the question then comes is, do we have enough time to get them to where we want them? And so in 2020, we tested Dagon, Hesta, and Marta. We're going to continue this again another year to get the a second set of numbers for people. But we think that almost anyone will grow here, and it really kind of, as you look at them, this is probably a good place to start. There's lots of them out there, and sometimes we can't test them all. There's a lot more kabocha squash varieties out there than the 10 that we tested this past year as well. And so you need to kind of get a reference, and then you compare against the reference, and then you use that to make new choices. So here's just some of those. When we looked at nutrient needs, basically what we assessed was, first we did a soil test. And so if you haven't done your soil test, first do that so that you kind of know what your nutritional needs are. That helps us make a decision as if we're going to need to add some extra phosphorus or some extra potassium to our system. If you can and can afford it, make sure that we know what our organic matter levels are like and what our nitrate soil levels are like, because we can use those as soil credits. And I like to do that in our trials so that we basically subtract out. If we have some nitrate test, we can take this formula, 3.6 times whatever that value was on your soil test for nitrates. We can extract that out from the amount that we had, because that's already in the soil. If we got organic matter in our system, as we get more organic matter, those can become credits, because there's always some release from organic matter for nutrients back into the system, and in particular for nitrogen. And so that helps us then make some determinations. And then if we look at the uptake patterns, so this image down in the corner kind of shows us the uptake patterns after we transplant the crop over the growth cycle of the plant. And this is some information that came from California. It basically says that for something like nitrogen, the blue line, we need their recommendations, say for Brussels sprouts, to be somewhere between 150 and 200 units of nitrogen that are required, or pounds of nitrogen that are required to grow the crop. And so we took that number 150 as our kind of value to go with and focus on. And then if you look at phosphorus, the plant needs somewhere around 125 pounds of nitrogen. And we can look at that on this axis. Their data suggests that phosphorus value somewhere around 40 pounds might be extracted by the plant. So we have to cover the sprout and the stem and the leaves and the roots. And so they kind of recommend somewhere around 125 pounds of N. And then potassium needs a little bit more. Well, Utah soils are fairly high in phosphorus and potassium if we've been regularly cropping them. And so we got by with much smaller amounts. And we focused this year, our soils were like, oh, we really don't need to add any of these other elements. What we really need is nitrogen. And so we went and did that and focused mostly on it. And we use those starting values from the recommendations from California and a few other sources, and said, oh, the ranges that we need to get, the high end was, some of them had high as 250, and I thought that was excessive. Some of them were as low as 125, but those were in situations where they had a lot of organic matter in their soil. And so we kind of said, well, what happens if we go low, medium level, so 100, 150, and 200 were our test levels. And we applied that on a sliding scale of 5, 10, or 15 pounds of nitrogen per week during our injections while we were irrigating. And that brought us through the start of the system, but we planted right around the 1st of May, and we applied 50 pounds of base to each one of these, and then ramped it up slowly so that by the middle of August, we had applied all of our nitrogen, and that then met that nitrogen needs. And then we were looking at, we had to worry about, because the literature says, and other producers say, that if you increase the nitrogen too much, you increase yield, you get you get less small sprouts, so you grow them to market size, but you also get more culls. And we were trying to track that so that we would have equal, try to get good yields with minimizing the amount of cull sprouts that were being produced. And so this sliding scale worked really quite nice for us, and the crop did really good. And then, so essentially we're kind of trying to track our nitrogen needs so that by the time the plant is kind of in that early sprout stage, we're going to kind of terminate our nitrogen application. So here's the middle of August. That's where we're stopping nitrogen. But another thing that we also need to do is that sometimes we know nitrogen just fuels leaf growth, and sprouts themselves are leaves, but the main growing point wants to just keep growing. And so we also had to top those plants. At some point, we needed to say, I'm going to terminate the growth of that plant to try and encourage those sprouts to grow. And so I have to pick a termination date. And our termination date was somewhere in mid-August as well. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. Irrigation. We basically tried to keep this at field capacity. We knew that those plants really like moisture. We kind of know what the water use is. We developed a budget, and we kind of monitored that moisture over the course of the season. And we know that if we are short on water, even though the brassica crops are all fairly drought tolerant, that it slows their growth and it limits their yield, and it creates this non-uniformity. And more importantly, this bitter off flavor component is part of the reason that we don't want to short the plant on water, because that's what gives us that bitterness. So some of those off flavors start to show up. And there is a potential that we get some tip burn, which is a calcium related deficiency that shows up in the leaf tissue. And we don't want a leaf tip in the middle of a Brussels sprout to have tip burn, because then when someone cuts it open and they see this kind of decaying tissue in there that's not rot related, but is nutritionally related, that's really, really undesirable. So what we know is that you can furrow irrigate, you could drip irrigate. So here's our trial out on the farm. We're drip irrigating this. Basically, these plants root very deeply. Transplants a little shallower, so transplants in that 24 to 36 inch range. If you're direct seeding or direct drilling, you can get roots that go all the way down to 4 feet deep. The best thing to do is monitor, and that's what we do. We put soil moisture sensors in that root zone. We want to try and keep that moisture quite high in the where the roots are developing. And on a seasonal basis, we're averaging about 25 inches, 26 inches of water that is needed to maintain that. And our drip line, which is this trial here, we kept all of these on drip, did a very, very good job of maintaining and meeting the water requirements. So topping becomes really important for that. And generally, we top in mid-August, or when we start to see those early sprouts starting to form in the axils of the leaf on that elongating stem. And the purpose of topping is to get uniformity. we want every sprout from the bottom to the top to be the same size. And that's how we accomplish that. So in mid-August, we went in and we reached into the top of the plant right up here in the top, and we just clipped out or broke off that growing point. And what that does is that transfers photosynthetic energy from the leaves to these sprouts that are in the axil of the leaves and creates them and stimulates them to grow at the same rate. And the net effect of that is every sprout from the bottom to the top of the plant now is the same size and the same weight, and that creates uniformity for us. And so if we look at that a little bit differently, we can do that with an older open pollinated variety. We're working with these hybrid types down here at the bottom, and hybrids are known for their uniformity. But if we don't top those plants, you can see some of the sprouts at the bottom are growing quite large, but these ones up at the tip are very small, and we want that. Now, in a home garden, maybe that's useful for you to have non-uniform sprouting, because then you just strip off a few sprouts at the bottom of the plant, you allow the next ones to go and the next ones to go, and that gives you continuous production. But if I'm taking Brussels sprouts to the farmer's market in late September and into October, I would like to bring that whole stalk, just chop it off at the ground level, remove the leaves off of it, and market that whole unit to my consumer there. They like to see that. They've never seen them that way. They buy them by the stalk, and you can price them accordingly. And they know that they can go home and strip them off themselves and prepare them, or you as a producer can have them pre-stripped, and it makes it much easier to deal with the harvesting, because you just cut off half of your this chunk of plants and strip them off and have sprouts available for the consumer. And then the next harvest time, you go in and grab the next bunch and do it. And you do that through many weeks in the autumn part of the year. And that allows you a much, much more efficient way to harvest and manage those crops. So we looked at that. Here's two examples. We said, should we top them or shouldn't we top them? Well, up here at the top, we have Dagan and untopped. And you can see down at the bottom of the plants, oh, look at all those sprouts are forming nicely. But up here at the top of the plant where it wasn't sprouted, we had very few sprouts that were of size that we could market. And effectively, that showed that if we didn't top Dagan, here we only had about 40% of our crop that was usable, of the sprouts that were usable. In our Dagan topped, here that is topped, you can see much, much more uniformity along those stalks. We had a much, much higher usable percentage. Now, one of the issues we had in here, we had quite increased number of culls, and that culls were due to damaged by insects. We had a really serious outbreak of diamondback moth, and it was hard to get it under control. And once those moths kind of got the worms and larvae got in and underneath those leaves, they were really, really hard to protect. And so that one was just an issue of, oh, we haven't grown this crop before, and we weren't really expecting this to happen, and it kind of got out of hand. And so in this coming year, we're going to repeat this trial. We should be able to bring these numbers back down to values of, maybe 0.5, because there's always culls. And that then transfers all of that information over into our yield line, which would be good for us. So in this thing, we're seeing reasonably good yields, but usable was not as high as we would like, and most of that was due to these insect-related damaged ones. And so we're going to continue this and get it going. Weed management was pretty easy. We did some mechanical stuff. We used plastic mulch in our trial and grew the crop on a mulch. And then we did some herbicide applications between the rows, and net effect of that was early in the season, we had very acceptable weed management. This picture here was probably taken in early to mid-June. And it was quite a simple thing for us to manage weeds. And there are plenty of herbicides and other approaches to do. This list, it gives you some of those herbicides, and it'll be available on the presentation, and it's also available in our pesticide, our production guide, and our production guide is available online. And I would highly recommend that all of our listeners download that production guide to their computer so that you have ready access to it. Or I know Nick's going to reference it as well, and I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about what that guide does, because he's the guy that has been helping to put this together on a regular basis, and I'm just kind of supplying information, and so we'll go with that. So understand establishment, get we're looking for early production. We want lots of sprouts by late September. Make sure you get your nutrition right, water correctly, deal with your weeds early, and the net effect of that is that you're not going to run into too many production problems. And I'm going to post our findings. I'm just finishing the report on that, and those production findings will be on our extension production horticulture website, where you can go into the vegetable section and find those. So here's a couple publications that you may want, and I'm going to end there, Nick. And
okay, let me see if we have any. If you guys have questions, put them in the Q&A portion, not the chat.
And I'm going to stop my sharing, and then Claudia can load up her presentation, and I'll address any questions that are out there about sprouts.
Okay, here's kind of a long one.
Yep.
How do I know when to top Brussels sprouts for my local condition to maximize uniformity without reducing yields? Will the optimum stalk length differ with where they are growing?
It makes a little bit of difference, but I think most of our production areas that grow good brassicas throughout Utah have climate conditions that aren't too dissimilar to Logan. So if you're in the Salt Lake Valley and those areas, I would probably think about topping somewhere between August 15 and September 1st. And you could probably go as late as September 1st. We chose August 15 because our plants were at about 3.5 feet tall. So we knew that there were lots of sprouts. Each plant had somewhere between 70 and 80 leaves. So that meant there was going to be at least 70 or 80 sprouts. And so we figured that that was a safe time. And what we're going to do in our trial this year, because we're going to repeat it, we're going to actually pick a couple more topping dates so that we can kind of answer that question a little bit more clearly. But right now, I would say if you're in the Salt Lake Valley region, probably September 1st. If you're in the rest of Utah, except St. George and the hot desert regions, top around the somewhere between the 15th and 30th of August. And that gives them about 6 weeks to size. And then the best flavors on the sprouts actually occur after we get a couple frosts on the plant. And we usually get our first frost in mid to late September. But these plants are really hardy, and we harvested as late November and still had beautiful sprouts. And we just left them standing out in the field on the stalk and harvested as we needed.